Ladies and gentlemen, it is a pleasure to introduce the closing speaker in our final session this morning, Governor of New Jersey, Chris Christie. Each year, we at the Council of the Americas try to have a sitting governor come and speak to us at the Washington conference. And this year, we are just delighted to have you with us. And I want you to know you were on our radar screen to do this since you went to Mexico last year. Governor Christie was sworn into office in 2010, is now in his second term. And over the past 5 years, Governor Christie has implemented an aggressive reform agenda covering fiscal accountability, so critical, taxes, pension and health benefits, and of course, public education. For those of us from Latin America, we know that these topics sound very, very familiar. Recently, his administration has made trade and diplomacy in the region a priority, and his recent missions to Mexico and Canada, I think in the UK too,
yes,
are indicative of this, where the governor focused on both trade and energy. And the governor's dedication and commitment to his state and his constituents prior to being governor were also seen as when he was in the role of U.S. Attorney for the District of New Jersey. There he fought against political corruption, corporate crime, and less talked about issues, but issues that are so important, such as human trafficking and environmental pollution. So with that, why don't we just welcome the governor.
Thank you.
And jump right into some of the questions that I know we've been thinking about. So you had a mission to Mexico and to Canada last fall. Number one, why did you choose those two countries? And I understand you had very successful trips in both, but did they meet your expectations?
Well, Susan, first off, thank you to everybody for inviting me and having me here today. I'm looking forward to this and to talking about these topics with you. You know, it was not accidental that I made those selections. I'd only made one other foreign trip as governor of New Jersey back in 2012. I had traveled to Israel. But when we decided to do foreign travel in 2014, I intentionally selected Mexico and Canada because I really feel like we need to make these neighbors of ours a first thought, not an afterthought. And the fact is that the best way to do that is to meet people, to let them know by your physical presence and your interest in what's going on in their countries that they're important partners of ours. In New Jersey, for instance, as with most states, Canada and Mexico are two top trading partners. And so much of New Jersey's economy is dependent upon trade, and these are our two biggest partners. And so the idea of going there was not only, my view of wanting to send a very strong signal to the people and the governments in both those countries that I believe we need to spend much more time on our own hemisphere and on our continent, but also because I wanted to acknowledge and have the opportunity to expand our business and trade relationships with Canada and Mexico and the business folks who call those places home. It did meet my expectations. In many ways, it exceeded my expectations. We signed some significant agreements in Mexico, both on Connect America. We're the first state to have signed an agreement such as that in terms of connecting businesses through the internet. And secondly, we signed a higher education agreement that was really spurred by my visit to Puebla and my meetings with the governor there, there are many people from Puebla who have immigrated to New Jersey. And there's a high level of awareness in Puebla about New Jersey, which is why I visited there. The governor at the time said, couldn't we have a higher education exchange directly between New Jersey and Puebla? We signed that agreement there. That's now being implemented right in the vicinity of our state capital. We have young men and women from there coming to New Jersey to study, and we're sending people to Mexico as well. So those agreements in Mexico were important and have helped, and not to mention the number of business contacts we made there. So in that sense, in Mexico, the trip really exceeded my expectations, and very similar type of experience in Canada, and our ability to be able to talk to our Canadian friends in a way that made them understand that their business is really valued by the people and the businesses of our state. So great communications that have continued since I left.
That's great. And you had, obviously I don't want to know about your confidential discussions with President Peña Nieto and Prime Minister Harper, but you obviously had some private discussions with them. Could you share a little bit of your impressions about both leaders, and were there common issues raised with both leaders?
Sure. First off, President Peña Nieto and I met for the first time in the summer of 2013 in Sun Valley, Idaho, at the Allen Conference. He was there as a speaker and asked if we could have a meeting. And it was supposed to be, as it was advertised to me by the organizers of Allen, kind of a 5-minute photo op, get to meet him, take a picture, and leave. It turned out that we sat there for 45 minutes. And we found that we had a lot of similar approaches to problems and a lot of similar concerns about the way the governments we were leading were operating. Then, when I decided to make the trip to Mexico, it was at his invitation in Sun Valley. He initiated the idea that I come to Mexico and visit. I was in the middle of a re-election campaign at the time, and I told him it wasn't going to be in 2013, but it would be in 2014. And I admire the president's approach to some really difficult problems in Mexico. He inherited some really entrenched historical problems that were barriers to economic development in Mexico that he's decided to take on in a very frontal way, most particularly, obviously, the denationalization of the energy industry. And we spent a lot of time talking about that, and also had the opportunity to meet with the CEO of Pemex, a meeting that the president set up for me himself. And we spoke a lot about those economic investment issues in our meeting. But just as importantly, he's a reformer. And he's taking on some really tough issues down there in criminal justice and economic development, the energy industry. And so I find him to be really refreshing, extraordinarily bright, and a very good politician. This is somebody who really understands how to communicate and relate with people, whether they're the people he serves in Mexico or folks like me who come to visit. I felt very welcomed, very appreciated. And I think more than anything else, his message was that they want more of a relationship with the United States rather than less. They want to have more of a relationship in every way you can define that relationship, diplomatically, from an economic perspective, investment from our country, and so that was wonderful. As to Prime Minister Harper, I think he's really shown himself on the world stage to be someone who has a very clear set of values that he articulates very well, and is willing to stand behind, regardless of what the political winds may be at the moment. In my meeting with him, I found that to be absolutely the case. He's very blunt, he's very direct, and there were no minced words in that meeting about the priorities for his country and how much he values the relationship with our country and wants to see it expand even further. He regularly in our conversations referred to America as Canada's friend. And I think he really sees the relationship as a relationship amongst close friends. And same as President Peña Nieto, he just wants to see the expansion of that. And spent a lot of time talking to me about how much the Canadian people are both invested in and interested in what happens in the United States, not only economically, but politically as well. So the opportunity for a governor to be able to sit and have private meetings with the president and the prime minister also added to the trip significantly, and have continued those relationships since I've left September in Mexico and December in Canada.
And do you see a lot of economic opportunity coming out of both of those trips for New Jersey?
No question. I mean, one of the things was in Mexico, we had the president of Rutgers, our state university there. They are working with higher education in Mexico to have even more partnerships, which are moving into the biotech area to help. Rutgers has a great capacity for that and is sharing those resources with their sister institutions in Mexico. And that all is going to lead to greater economic development in a state like ours, where pharmaceuticals and biotech are such an important part of the really good paying jobs that we have in New Jersey. And so looking for our way to be able to expand on that, we've seen some real results from President Barchi's continued communications with the Mexicans in particular.
That's very interesting. Now, when you were in Mexico and Canada, you gave some big speeches, very well attended. I saw at least your Mexican speech
Yep.
on television. And you really gave a vision for North America. I have two questions. Number one, what is your vision for North America? And number two, when you were talking to the Prime Minister and the President, did you just talk about the US and Mexico and Canada, or did you talk about your vision for North America with them?
Well, first on the question of vision for North America, we laid out in those speeches that I believe that North America has to become both the number one place for worldwide investment, and also that we're in the midst of an energy renaissance that we need to take advantage of, not only here in this country, but that we need to partner with Mexico and Canada to be able to really develop those, not only for each country's own internal economic benefit, but also for our geopolitical standing in the world. I emphasized in the speeches that I think we take it for granted that we live in the best neighborhood in the world. We live in a place where our neighbors share our economic system, share our political system, share many of the same cultural values, share a sense of respect for each other's sovereignty. No one is attempting to invade anybody else and create those problems that we see in so many places around the world. These are things that we take for granted. But if you look at any other neighborhood in the world, you don't have that combination of positive factors. And so a vision for North America is not only about what we develop further, but appreciating what we have already and being able to sell that to the rest of the world as a sense of political stability. Now, I talked to them about the fact that I really believe this idea of having them be a first thought, not an afterthought, is something that's going to be very important to world peace and stability. Having countries like the United States and Mexico and Canada become a greater and greater supplier of energy, in particular around the world, it'd be much different than having an energy supplied by other countries and other regions. And the stability that can help to lead to, and the influence that US, Canada, and Mexico can have around the world in a positive way to bring greater stability, to bring greater prosperity, and ultimately then greater peace, is something that I think was really important and something that both of them were interested in. And President Peña Nieto in particular was talking about the denationalization of their energy industry is in part about that. It's not just about Mexican prosperity. It's about Mexico becoming a bigger player in the world in partnership with its neighbors in the United States and Canada to be able to export not only our energy, but our approaches to the peaceful neighborhood that we have here. So I think that, unfortunately, all too often we take that for granted. If we spent, and many of you I'm sure have in this room, spent time in other neighborhoods of the world living there, it's a pretty good place to live. And we should appreciate that, and we should be making sure we reinforce that with our neighbors.
We totally agree with that this is a pretty good place, and we have a lot of common ground with all of our neighbors, including neighbors further south. So you took a trade mission to Mexico and to Canada. Are you thinking about any other ones, Brazil, other countries on your horizon?
Working on my day job at the moment. I've got a budget to finish between now and June 30th. We're going to look at the second half of the year about further foreign travel. We did make a trip, as you mentioned, to Great Britain in February, and a trade mission there as well, which was very fruitful, again, especially in the pharmaceutical and biotech industries where we have a lot of compatibility with Great Britain. And certainly, I've been encouraged and invited to come to South America, and definitely interested in doing that. Now it's really just a question of time with competing interests or a number of other things that are on my plate, is making the time. But for these kind of trips, you have to just make the time. I can always find things in New Jersey to fill my calendar every day. But you just have to make the time to do that, and I think you'll see us make time to travel more around the world. It's fascinating, and it's good for my state.
Right. And are you thinking about, you may already have them, and this is my ignorance, but, New Jersey, Mexico trade agreements, or New Jersey, Canada, or Brazil trade agreements?
We have some already with both Mexico and Canada, and it has been extraordinarily fruitful for us inside our state. As I said, they're our top two trading partners, and the relationships there. Remember that New Jersey is the most ethnically diverse state in America. And so for us, foreign trade is a part of our everyday ethos, because we live in a state where, depending upon which neighborhood, in which community you go to, you can find half a dozen to a dozen different ethnicities that have immigrated to our state and have worked their way into the fabric of our business community, our cultural community, our educational community. And so for New Jersey, these trade agreements are a natural outgrowth of our 8.9 million inhabitants. These are folks who have a real acute appreciation of how important those relationships are around the world, not only from an economic perspective, but for a greater understanding of each other. In a state that, I mean, it's an interesting combination. As I said, we're the most ethnically diverse state in the country, and we are the most densely populated state in the country. So we have a lot of different ethnicities right on top of each other. So the point is, our ability to be able to get along, our ability to be able to understand and have cultural tolerance, to make sure that everybody's understanding the traditions and the values that come from these different parts of the world, and to be able to learn from those and respect them is I think, one of the things that makes life in New Jersey so rich. But it takes time and attention to it. And seeing that the governor cares about those ethnicities by actually traveling to those home countries is very important, especially with our Mexican community. We have a very large Mexican community in New Jersey. We have the second largest Cuban American community in the country. We have a lot of different ethnicities that are disproportionately large to the rest of the country. So it's something that as governor you have to keep your eye on all the time and find ways to reach out and to create credibility.
I understand you're willing to take some questions from the floor?
Sure.
Okay, so the floor is open for anybody that would like to. Marty, please identify yourself.
Martin Schubert, European Inter-American Finance Corp. Being the time of the year we're at, have you defined yet what your policy is, being such a governor of such a diverse state, toward the U.S. immigration law?
Well, I think there's a few things to be said about this. I think first is, in New Jersey, we have a number of folks who are there in undocumented status. And I've met many of these folks. I will tell you this, none of them have ever come to me and said, the reason we came here, Governor, was to vote. They all say to me they came here to work. And I'm not someone who believes that folks who have come here in that status are going to engage in self-deportation. And having spent a lot of time in law enforcement, I understand the extraordinary challenge of trying to deal with this many folks. And so I think we need to define first, what is the real circumstance that we're in as a country? What are we willing to engage in? And what are we just simply unable to deal with? And remember the motivation of most of these folks who have come, which is that they come here for greater economic opportunity to try to support not only themselves, but their families. And so all that has to be considered in the greater picture of also saying, as a country, we need to make sure that we have borders that respect our sovereignty. And, you know, we haven't done that. And we're in this circumstance again after actions were taken by President Reagan in the mid-'80s because we have not effectively done that. And I think it's very hard to ask the American people to understand why that has happened if we don't have a solid plan going forward for how we're going to make sure it doesn't happen once again if we make changes. And so part of this is, you know, folks can, in politics on this, can say a whole bunch of different things that may be, at best, aspirational, but may not be realistic. I think we need to tell the truth to people about how we deal with this situation and this issue. And we start off by defining the parameters of both what is likely and what is possible to be done under the current circumstances. And that's the way I approach the problem.
Thank you. There's a question over here.
Thank you. Hello, Governor. My name is Devry Bufner-Vorwerk, and I represent a company called Cargill, which is a food and agriculture company. We're invested in 67 countries worldwide, but all across Latin America. And first of all, I'd like to commend you on the efforts that you're making for outreach as a governor to the international space. I mean, for us, it's incredibly important, and you know this. We don't have to convince you. We hear you saying it. It's incredibly important for businesses in New Jersey, but it's important for American companies. 45% of U.S. exports are linked to U.S. investment overseas, so you get it clearly. My question for you would be, given in your travels to Mexico and other places across the globe and the region, have you had conversations around the importance of trade agreements? Right now we're facing the largest trade agreement we'll ever face as the United States, the Trans-Pacific Partnership that includes several Latin American economies. We've seen positively some greater possible openings with Cuba. Cargill chairs a coalition called the U.S. Agriculture Coalition for Cuba that has grown immensely over the last year, that has the entire U.S. agriculture and farm base from California to Iowa all the way to the East Coast behind it. And so I'm just wondering if you could share your perspective around how those conversations have gone in your travels, what you think in terms of trade agreements and trade policies, advancing U.S. investment and further integrating the region. It would be great to just hear your perspective on it, Governor.
Sure.
Thank you.
Thank you. First off, I'm a person who believes that America and Americans can compete anywhere with anyone and do extraordinarily well. So we should not be afraid of engaging in broad-based trade agreements. We need to make sure that those trade agreements are negotiated in a way that are fair and consistent and reliable, right? So, for instance, if we're talking about trade promotion authority, to give trade promotion authority, which I generally support, you also have to have confidence in the people who are negotiating the agreements. If you don't have that, there's going to be great pushback on that idea. And so we need to make sure that we have real confidence in the fact that those type of agreements will be negotiated in a way that recognizes American interests and America's role in the world as a promoter of trade. Secondly, I do think that we need to take another look at NAFTA. You know, it's been 20 years now since NAFTA was put into effect. And what's the next chapter going to look like? We know what's happened over the last 20 years with NAFTA, but I think we need to be talking to our neighbors about what the next generation of NAFTA will look like, and we should be engaging those conversations. Also, it might make sense for us to take a bit of a more continental approach in terms of the Canadians and the Mexicans and how we get involved with TTIP and in other ways. Now, you know, if we want to create a strong continent, as I talked about in that last question, mostly centered around energy, it's not that we should abandon our own domestic concerns and approaches, but I think there are many ways that we could work with the Canadians and the Mexicans to make North America an even more powerful force in all this. But to do that, you have to pay attention to them, you have to listen, and then you have to be willing to compromise. All of those things are elements of doing this the right way, and something that I'd be an advocate of exploring. Lastly, as to Cuba, I will tell you this. I have no problem with Cuba becoming a member of the family of civilized nations in this country, but first they have to act in a civilized way. This is a country that continues to be ruled by a dictatorial family regime that denies civil rights and freedoms to their people, and they're a sponsor of terrorism. And I know this particularly in New Jersey. They're harboring, as we sit here today, and have been harboring for decades, a woman who murdered a New Jersey State Police officer, who was tried and convicted by a jury of her peers in New Jersey, who was imprisoned, who was broken out of prison, and escaped to Cuba, and has been harbored there by the Castro regime for decades, while this trooper's wife, widow, still sits in New Jersey waiting for justice to be done for her husband and their children. So this is a particularly personal issue to me. If Cuba wants to be taken off the terrorist watch list, if Cuba wants to have normalized relations, then at a minimum, we should stop harboring terrorists. Joanne Chesimard is on the FBI's top 10 domestic terrorist watch list. How do we engage in these kind of conversations with Cuba if, in fact, they are harboring people who our own FBI has on the top 10 domestic terrorist watch list? So I have no problem with Cuba being welcomed back into the family of civilized nations, but you have to be civilized. And harboring a cop killer is not civilized conduct. Raul Castro saying that he wants Guantanamo Bay back and wants reparations, I don't think are the basis for a productive ongoing relationship. So I have pretty strong feelings on this piece of it, on the Cuba piece, that are at odds with my feeling about trade in other places, but they're at odds because it's based on fact. Fact that does not exist with our other countries that we're engaging in trade with. So, I don't think we should be a result in search of a rationale. Let's have the Cuban government show that they're willing to start to respect individual freedoms and liberty. Be a civilized part of the world by turning over terrorists who have been convicted by a jury in this country for murder of a police officer. Send Joanne Chesimard back. Then maybe we can start to talk about what you want to do in terms of normalization of relations with Cuba. I don't have a philosophical problem with welcoming people back in who have gone astray, but they got to show that they're going to stop going astray. And I don't think we've seen nearly enough evidence of that right now. So that's a real concern of mine, and it's a personal concern. I'm protected every day by the New Jersey State Police. These are men and women who put their lives on the line every day. This trooper gave his life unnecessarily, and our criminal justice system worked the way it's supposed to. And we have Cuba deciding to play judge, jury, and harborer with Joanne Chesimard. That's not right, and I don't think we should be normalizing relations or taking people off the terrorist watch list who continue to harbor terrorists in this world. Not right.
You talked about your vision for North America, but a lot of people also talk about the big hemispheric vision and how the hemisphere, which I strongly believe can be the most competitive hemisphere in the world. Could you take your view of North America and kind of apply it to the hemisphere?
Sure. Listen, again, from our perspective, we have a lot of common shared values and approaches throughout the hemisphere. And that's a wonderful basis to start an even more robust relationship. But like with any human relationship, the way you develop it is time. It is the expenditure of time and attention. And if we don't spend more time and pay more attention to the countries in our hemisphere, we will not develop deeper, more trusting relationships. And that applies to trade, to military relationships, diplomatic relationships. These are all extraordinarily important. But it seems to me that we only seem to pay attention to these things when something starts burning out of control. It becomes much more expensive to deal with the issue then, both in terms of money, but in terms of human capital as well. I think that part of the problem, I shouldn't say problem, part of the challenge of living in this friendly neighborhood is that you don't feel like you have to pay attention to it. It's not biting at you every day. And as a result, you say to yourself, well, all right, everything's fine here. Let me go spend time in other places where the fires are burning more intensely. I understand that instinct, but I think that instinct is misguided. Because if we develop an even stronger base of cooperation and shared values in this hemisphere, it makes our ability as a collective group of nations even stronger to be able to bring peace and prosperity and stability to the rest of the world. If we have to drag people along kicking and screaming because they haven't seen us, it's like anything else, right? In any human relationship, if the only time you call somebody is when you need something, that person tends to be a little skeptical. We shouldn't be in the business as the United States of just calling our neighbors when we need something. And we shouldn't be in the business, quite frankly, of denying our friends reasonable accommodations when they ask for them. And that's why I think that the decision on Keystone was so misguided. It is not the act of a friend to deny reasonable accommodations to people when those accommodations are asked for. And Canada has shown over the period of recent history that they have made very difficult political and governmental decisions to support actions by the United States that enhanced our ability to be successful around the world. I don't think that the request of building this pipeline was so out of line that we should take the position that the answer is absolutely no, and quite frankly, being insulting in the process. It's not what you do with friends. So my point is, we have to look at these relationships as both individual, micro friendships, and then larger macro friendships that will be being judged on by other countries who are observing how we deal with Canada, how we deal with Mexico. And other countries in the hemisphere will be looking at that to say, okay, what's possible for us? What kind of relationship can we have? How much of our time and resources should we invest in this? And people are making those evaluations every day. We make them every day in our personal relationships and our professional relationships. Why do we think that leaders of nations don't do exactly the same thing in trying to lead their countries? And so my broader vision for the hemisphere is to say, let us spend time here at home in our hemisphere to develop it, because it won't take nearly as long as it will take in other parts of the world because of our shared values. Spend time, develop those relationships, make them stronger. We don't know, and nor could we anticipate, when we'll need them and when they'll need us. But it'll be a lot easier to make that phone call if it's the 6th phone call you've had with that leader of that nation, rather than the first one. And that means an investment of the time of the people who lead this government in our country. And this is regardless of party. This is not a partisan issue. There has been neglect in both parties on this front. So let's not make it a partisan issue, because it isn't one, it doesn't need to be one. It's an American issue that we need to confront and that we need to encourage our leaders to engage in a greater fashion. And it's one of the reasons that I traveled to Mexico and Canada, and it's one of the reasons that I accepted the invitation to be here today. I think there needs to be more voices in leadership at every level of government around this country who talks about the importance of this. I think if we do, it becomes more generally accepted and in fact may be required of folks moving forward, and that would be a good thing for our country and for our neighbors.
Well, with that, Governor Christie, I want to thank you very much for spending the time with us. And I think your leadership, there's nothing better to convince people and the peoples of the United States that this is a good thing than to see their leaders, such as yourself, go to places like Mexico and Canada and engage with the leaders. That helps drive home to the normal American citizen how important this is and how this will affect positively their prosperity.
Thank you,
So
Susan.
with that, I want to thank you very much. And you know that our doors are always open.
Thank you.
Thank you.